All right, hey folks, so it's Faz here from Faz Lifts, and today we're going to talk about volume and how much volume should we do. And I'm actually going to frame this video in the context of beginners, intermediate, and advanced lifters. So hopefully that should give you guys some context and be able to relate it to where you are at in your journey. But firstly, thanks for making it onto my channel. If you have any questions or comments, pop them down below. And if you'd like to work with me on your own strength and physique goals, there's a link in the description. So let's get on with it. Now, we're going to start off with the definition of a set because I think that's important. I've spent a long time going over this over the last couple of weeks, so we're not going to go over it again all the way, but hopefully you realize by now the intensity of a set matters because it affects total set volume. So we can't really discuss volume without firstly just hammering down what an actual set consists of. So it's got to be a hard set, okay? So I've given examples before where I feel people who are doing multiple sets, which are relatively easy, are probably not stimulative enough to be counted as sets. And that's really where the problem lies. We have to tell people to work harder, which is not a bad message, but hopefully this video will give you a bit more of a nuance into that and how it affects volumes. So usually those people who are, benching like 8, 8, 8, and 6, it doesn't really matter because for the most part, they're beginners. So they can pretty much do anything in progress. So the actual volume out of those 4 sets is probably quite low, but who cares at that point? They're beginners, pretty much anything can work. They can do a lot, they can do a little, it doesn't matter. So the stimulus needed to grow at that point is actually quite small, so it doesn't really matter. So let's move on to the main portion of this. So firstly, beginners. Now, beginners as a whole need the least. So if we just make this a little bit bigger, the very definition of a beginner is that the gains come easy, all right? So minimal volumes are needed. Now this here becomes the irony. Minimal volumes are needed, but also it's very easy for them to recover from higher and higher volumes as well. So it doesn't really matter what they do, right? Because the beginner is not yet capable of inflicting the type of damage on the body with training that the intermediate and advanced guys are. So they can do a small amount of volume, they can do a high amount of volume, they're still going to recover super fast and be ready to go again. Now, that means they're in a lovely situation where they don't need much to grow because they recover very quickly. And as long as they get in there and work hard, it doesn't really matter what they do. So we have a situation where we can afford to train the beginner relatively frequently. And you'll see in my beginner booklets, the noob, that the beginners are training 3 times a week because they can do that. They're recovering it super quick and they can go again, which just means faster and faster progress. So I would recommend 2 or 3 times a week, bordering on 3 times a week for a beginner per week per muscle group. Works nicely. And about 1 to 6 sets per those sessions. Yes, as little as 1 set works in the initial stages. It works very, very well. 1 set done 3 times a week of some exercises works tremendously well. I normally don't start with beginners that low because there's also the portion of just learning how to train because their weights are going to be so low. They don't really get many warm-up sets. So doing about 3 sets tends to average it out quite nicely, and that's usually where I begin. So caveat for you beginners listening out there who might be wondering, scratching their head and thinking about the rest of the video that is to come, most of what you see on YouTube Fitness and most of what's going to be in the rest of this video does not apply to you yet. So what's the value? What's the value in listening to me? What's the value in listening to this video? What's the value in listening to all this kind of stuff if it doesn't apply? Because at a certain point, if you don't have the knowledge to progress, if you just think whatever you're doing works and is your world, it will stop working. Pretty much everyone hits a hard plateau when they reach the intermediate stage. And a lot of people just live in that intermediate stage forever. Like they'll just stay there the whole time. So yes, it becomes vitally important to pick this stuff up. But you need to be intelligent enough to understand that, okay, I can understand the material. I understand what he's saying, but I also know it's not for me right now. You should have enough intelligence to be able to sift through information and think, okay, it doesn't apply to me yet, but when I hit a plateau, this is when it's going to apply. So I can take it in without it affecting my worldview right now. It's a high skill, but hopefully, that's something which you can learn from. As a beginner, you should be listening to topics like this because it'll give you an idea of what to do when you do stall. And you want to get to that intermediate stall because it means you've progressed past the beginner stage. You shouldn't be spending that long as a beginner. So quick summary here before we move on. Beginners need the least as reflected in my new book, they can go in, they can train, and they can recover and be ready to go in again in a couple of days. So they need the least, and they just want to set themselves up for good habits down the line. So they should be practicing the big movement patterns, should be learning how to work hard, and should be soaking up valuable information off YouTube Fitness on how to adjust things when they need to. So intermediates next. Now, as a general rule, intermediates usually need the most. In practical terms, volume requirements are higher than a beginner, and they're likely the highest of your entire career. This is because your ability to inflict damage is better than it was as a beginner, but it's still nowhere near as much as it will be when you're advanced. The poundage you lift, the mind-muscle connection, all of those things, the ability to actually fatigue the muscle and fatigue yourself, it won't be as high as when you're an advanced lifter, but it will be higher than as a beginner. So your recovery is still going to be okay. And it ends up at a balance where you're likely going to do the most work of your entire career in the intermediate stage. This is where total set count becomes very important, because if we remember the definition of volume, it's number of hard sets. The emphasis on that word there, hard, becomes more important now than ever. Because if you're going around and you're doing, say, 12 sets per session, 12 sets per muscle group per week, on the surface, you think that's okay. But if the majority of those sets are easy, non-stimulative sets, you're not doing 12 sets. And then you might not be doing enough to grow. Going back to our example of our beginner trainer again, if he's doing 4 sets per muscle 3 times a week, it's 12 total sets. But he's actually only doing one of those as a hard set. That's fine for him because he's a beginner. Now, that same beginner might go into the intermediate stage, try that then, and it not work. That's where it becomes important. And that's where you get the message of work harder, work harder, work harder, drilled into your skull by guys like myself, by guys like Steve Shaw, Jeffrey Veritas Schofield, and all the rest of the good guys on YouTube, because that's when it becomes important. Hopefully you're seeing that now. Like the sets that you may have thought were really good, hardworking sets, all of a sudden when you're an intermediate, they're not being pushed all the way. So that's when it matters. That's when you might start to see, okay, crap, I'm actually not progressing. Why is that? We look at your program and there are reasons there which might, well, there are possible avenues so we can explore, which might suggest why you're not progressing. And it may well be because you're doing, a quarter of the volume you thought you were. It's a very real possibility. So now more than ever at the intermediate stage is when your sets have got to be hard working sets, because this is when the total volume counts. This is where people should and probably will experiment with anywhere between 10 to 20 hard sets per muscle group per week and maybe more. So the question here is, why not do just minimal volume, carry on doing a low amount of volume, and settle for lower gains? Now, it's a very good question, and it's fine if it works. However, for a lot of people, minimal volume doesn't just mean slow gains at this stage, it means no gains. So I'll give you my example. When I was stuck at about a 90 kilos, 200-pound bench, about a 140 squat, which is about 300 pounds, and about a 420 deadlift, I needed a lot more work to actually progress. In the end, I look back and I counted up, and in the end, I was doing something in the region of 30 working sets for the upper body to actually progress to the point where I eventually benched 140 or 300 pounds for the first time. I wasn't one of those guys where minimal level of volume just meant low progress or slow progress. It actually meant zero progress. So this is the stage where people get stuck, but this is really the stage where you see a wide variety in volumes of what people actually need to progress. This is where it becomes important to experiment between the low ends, the high ends, and everything in between to actually see what you need to do. And it becomes doubly important to actually make sure those are hard, stimulative sets. And I'll refer you back to the video that I recorded, that I released earlier this week. And that will tell you a bit more about what I feel is a good sign for what is a stimulative hard set. Okay, so just to summarize before we move on, intermediates at this stage, they usually need the most, practically speaking, simply because the volume requirements are up from when they were a beginner, and they can get away with a lot more volume than an advanced guy can because they're just not lifting that as much weight. This is when you should experiment with low to high volumes. It behooves you in your progress to experiment with set volumes as high as 20 to 30. But those set volumes have also got to be stimulative sets, because if they're not, it's pointless. Yeah. So this is where you see people on YouTube hammer on and on about hard working sets. And in a weird way, some guys on YouTube will actually talk about how their set volume went down when they started to work harder, because what's actually happened is they were doing more stimulative sets. It's just they were doing less total sets, because, I mean, 20 piss-ass sets which don't get you any results, is that more or less than 12 really, really hard sets which do? I would argue the 12 hard sets is actually more volume. It's just the guy was kind of pretending to do more volume when he was doing 20 sets. So that's kind of where the problem is. And that's a lot of people fall into that trap, which is why volume and intensity are really important concepts to discuss and flesh out, so we know exactly what we're talking about. I think we're all pretty clear on what set volume is. We're all pretty clear on what frequency is. And as I say over and over again on this channel recently, intensity is very, very important at this stage in particular, because it defines volume and it defines everything else. So hopefully that's made sense for the intermediates. All right, that's a quick summary. Now for advanced guys, quick trigger warning, this is not going to apply to many of you, so don't get hung up on it. But theoretically, volume requirements should just continue to go up and up and up, because you go from beginner to intermediate to advanced, you need more and more and more. Practically speaking, that's not true though. Practically, it becomes harder and harder to recover from the sheer damage being inflicted every session. And typically speaking, this is where you'll see a lot of advanced guys do a lot of kind of bodybuilder joint friendly work at this stage. They'll tend to experiment with high repetitions. They'll tend to experiment with recovery modalities, all the kind of recovery stuff, which if you're a beginner or intermediate, you might think are kind of pointless. Like, you know, super high reps for elbows, like Alex from Alpha Destiny recommends, winning warm-up, stuff like that, all that kind of stuff. It's not as useful before this stage unless you are, you know, older or suffering from joint problems. So yeah, theoretically, volume requirements should just go up and up. However, in practical speaking, they actually come back down. And with the advanced guys, the truly advanced guys, you see that their set volume tend to be quite moderate. So from what I've seen, usually along the lines of about 15 to 20 hard working sets per week tend to be, and that also comes with a lot of volume cycling. So if the high volumes are done, then they're done with extensive volume intensity and volume cycling. This is when it gets complicated. At this point, some sort of intensity volume management is crucial. And I'll tell you why this is. And this third paragraph is probably the best summary of the paradox of advanced training that you guys will ever hear. Just from a theoretical standpoint, the amount necessary to stimulate more gains at this stage is beyond the amount you can actually recover from. So that, in effect, what will happen is, as you continue to build more and more into the training cycle, your fatigue will just rise and rise and rise. So you will have to do some sort of intensity cycling technique. Let me just say that again. The amount of damage and stimulus necessary to actually improve you at the advanced stage is more than you can recover from in a medium-term basis. So fatigue will continue to build and you will need to have some sort of fatigue drop. I recommend deloads for that reason. Other prominent YouTubers like Natural Hypertrophy, they do other types of intensity cycling. And I think those are fine. I think what Natural Hypertrophy recommends rather than deloads is fine as well. I've done that in the past myself. I don't see a difference between really theoretically what I recommend and what he recommends. Deload versus intensity and volume cycling is two sides of the same coin. It's still dealing with the problem. Just like Alex has his own way of doing conjugate style training where he rotates through waves. They're all solutions to the same problem. So I don't have a problem with any of that. The point is simply that at this stage, volume intensity does need to be cycled. That's the only point. How you do it is irrelevant. So there is no, you know, oh, one coach says deloads are mandatory, the other coach says they're not. All everyone is saying is at this stage, some intensity volume cycling needs to happen because, again, the amount of stimulus that is needed to improve at this point is beyond what you can recover from on a regular basis. So there has to be stimulus, then drop off to reduce the fatigue, stimulus, then drop off to reduce the fatigue. So let's do a quick recap of everything. So recap, I'll make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see. For beginners, minimal volumes needed to progress. Okay, could be anything between 1 to 6 sets per muscle per session. This generally lends itself well to higher frequencies because, one, the amount of damage they can inflict on themselves in any given session is very low. Even a hard set for a beginner is not actually a hard set on the body, not compared to what they will be doing when they're intermediate to advanced, the level of intensity, the mind-muscle connection, the weight on the bar. So they'll recover super quick. Okay, they're good to go again. So that means higher frequencies can be involved. The intensity at this stage doesn't matter per se. Okay, it'll certainly feel like they're working hard, but the whole idea of the RPE, RIR at this point is practically irrelevant. Theoretically, they might find it useful because they might want to know what they're going to be involved in doing when they're further along, maybe 2 or 3 years down the line. For intermediates, practically speaking, this is where we see the widest range of volumes and possibly the highest volumes for some areas. Something like 4 to 8 or even more sets per muscle per session is about average. Moderate frequencies are about 2 to 3. So this is where you tend to see the typical volume landmarks of you guys like James Krieger, Mike Israetel, and the like. Very, very typical stuff that you would see from them. Training muscle group, 2 or 3 times a week, 4 to 8 sets per muscle per session or more. Pretty much bang on. Now, the intensity matters now because it influences total set count. So from a beginner to an intermediate, set count becomes much more important because it's usually you need more work at this stage. So while the discussion around RPE and RIR is still interesting at this stage, really the message is just work harder. Okay, the main message is work harder at this point. It's still at this point work harder because recovery is still very good. Ability to inflict damage here is still quite moderate. The poundages you lift are relatively moderate. The amount of mind-muscle connection is relatively moderate. So the damage you can inflict on the muscle is relatively moderate. So your recovery is still pretty high. You just need to continue to aim to work harder at this stage. Next up is advanced. Practically speaking, this is where the volumes are fairly moderate. The actual stimulus you inflict from one working set, especially one which is accurately gauged as either 1 or 2 reps in reserve or to failure, is going to be huge. The amount of damage you can inflict on yourself per any one set is going to be way more than at any point in your training career, which means volume tends to come down because you're doing more damage per set. So we see volumes in the region of about 6 to 12 sets per muscle per session. This is when people might experiment with split routines, they might do lower to moderate frequencies, and it's fine. Frequency varies wildly at this point due to programming and cycling. You're going to see anything from bro splits right the way to full body every day with lots and lots of very intuitive cycling and programming involved. This is where people tend to do things a lot more intuitively because you can tell what's going to work just as you're warming up in the gym. So for the advanced guy here, there's a lot of room to maneuver, and what the advanced guy does can look wildly different from beginner and intermediate for those reasons. Intensity again matters as it influences total volume. However, at this stage, there is a high degree of either intuitive or planned cycling involved so that you don't burn out, yet you can still inflict enough damage on the muscle to grow. All right, folks. So hopefully that was an interesting insight into actual set volumes. And for you guys who are beginners, maybe a bit of an insight into what you can expect to see as you reach sort of intermediate phase and the advanced phase. For those of you really who are in intermediate, it kind of matters the most because I think the message to drive home for you guys is intensity matters. You've got to carry on trying to work harder. The RPE RIR talk, while it's interesting, at this intermediate stage, you've really just got to work harder because you're not going to be lifting crazy heavy weight relative to when you're an advanced lifter. Your total amount, so you can do more, you can get more, because you get away with more because your body needs more stimulus to grow. At this stage, you may or may not need some intensity cycling. You may just be able to work harder and harder and harder, but it certainly behooves you to experiment with a wide range of volumes, especially for lagging muscle groups. Like for me, lagging muscle groups were mostly the chest, shoulders. So I experimented with volumes right up to 30 sets for those areas, and that's finally what got me growing. So you don't necessarily have to do that for the rest of your career, but you may have to do that for a short period of time to get you past the plateau. And I think that's an interesting thing about volumes, because then going to the advanced guys, once you get to that level, the sheer volume that you lift with, the intensity that you lift with, it actually means that the amount you need to do goes down. So it's an interesting journey, and you can see why so many people get stuck alongside it, and why, equally speaking, it's also quite hard to communicate these things sometimes on the internet. So hopefully I do a good job of that, or at least a passable job of that. And as always, if you need some clarifications on this, do ask questions. I encourage that. I think it's important, to engage with your viewers and make sure that they're getting their questions answered. As long as you're curious about it, it's good. Just don't be closed-minded to stuff, because this is not stuff I'm just pulling out my arse. This is stuff that I see in people as a coach. So if you are a beginner, ask questions, but don't be closed-minded. Don't say, well, this is what I'm doing, I don't really want to hear about it, and what I'm doing is right. Just understand that at that stage, what you're doing, pretty much anything could work. You could do the exact opposite and it would work. So ask questions, but with an open mind. I find the intermediates tend to be the ones with the most open minds, because at that stage, a lot of them really are trying to figure stuff out. It's the intermediates who come in with the whole, I know what I'm doing. It's like, yeah. So do ask questions, and let's talk. But anyway, I will post this up, and I will speak to you guys in the next one. So take care.